A tonary is a liturgical book in the Western Christian Church which lists by incipit various items of Gregorian chant according to the Gregorian mode of the melodies within the eight-mode system. Tonaries often include office antiphons, the mode of which determines the recitation formula for the accompanying text. But a tonary may also or instead list responsories or mass chants not associated with formulaic recitation. Although some tonaries are stand-alone works, they were frequently used as an appendix to other liturgical books such as antiphonaries, graduals, tropas, and proses, and are often included in collections of musical treatises. Function and form. Tonaries were particularly important as part of the written transmission of plain chant, although they already changed the oral chant transmission of Frankish cantors entirely before musical notation was used systematically in fully notated chant books. Since the Carolingian reform, the ordering according to the octoechos assisted the memorization of chant. The exact order was related to the elements of the tetrachord of the finales, which were called protis, deuteris, tritis, and tetradus. Each of them served as the finales of two toni, the authentic and the plagal one. The 8 tones were ordered in these pairs: ordontus protis, plagi proti, ordontus deuteris, etc. Since Hucbald of St. Amand, the 8 tones were simply numbered according to this order. Tonus I8. Aquitanian cantors usually used both names for each section. The earliest tonaries, written during the 8th century, were very short and simple without any visible reference to psalmody. Tonaries of the 9th century already ordered a huge repertoire of psalmodic chant into sections of psalm tone endings, even if the melody was not indicated or indicated by later added neumes. Most of the tonaries which have survived until now can be dated back to the 11th and 12th centuries, while some were written during later centuries, especially in Germany. The treatise form usually served as a bridge between the octoechos theory and the daily practice of prayer, memorizing and performing the liturgy as chant and reciting the psalms. This can be studied at a 10th century treatise called Commemoratio Brevis de Tunise Psalmis Modulandis, which used the Deja signs of the Musica Ingeriades treatise in order to transcribe the melodic endings or terminations of psalmody. 11th century theorists like Guido of Arezzo or Hermann of Reichenau refused the Deja tone system, because it displayed tetraphonic tone system and not the Sistema Tellurian, which had all the pitches needed for the melos of the echoe. Nevertheless, the first example of the 8th chapter in Musica Ingeriades, called Quomodo ex qua or Sonorum viomnis toni producanta, already used the 5th of the protis for an illustration how Alleluia melodies are developed by the use of the intonation formula for the ordontus protis. The different forms of a tonary. Tonaries can differ substantially in length and shape. As a treatise, they usually describe the octave, 5th and 4th species of each tone, but also the modal characteristics like microtonal shifts of the change to another melodic frame. It can also be an abridged form, a breviary, which just show the sacramentary or antiphonary according to the liturgical year. The tonus of the antiphonal chant genres is indicated by later added rubrics as 8 for ordontus tetradus, or the Roman ordinals I8, according to Hucbald's system, as we can find it in the early tropa sequentiary of St. Gerard in Aurillac and the abridged antiphonary of St. Martial. The most common form was the shortest one, which had no theoretical explanation. Since the late 9th century, each section started with an intonation formula and the psalmody of the mode. Its pitches represented by letters are later by diastematic Noim notation. Subsections followed the different chant genres quoted as examples for the represented tone. Antiphonal refrains in psalm recitation, usually represented by its text incipit, were sorted according to various terminations used in psalmody. The so-called differentia. A very rare form of tonary is a fully notated one, which shows every chant genre ordered according to its tonus. A very famous example is the full tonary for Mass chant by Abbot William of Volpiano, written for his Abbey St. Benignus of Dijon. The tonary's function in chant transmission. During the Carolingian Reform, the tonary played a key role in the organization and the transfer of Roman chant, which had to be sung by Frankish cantors according to Charlemagne's Admonitio Generalis after it was decreed in 789. The historical background was the Second Council of Nicaea in 787, during which Pope Adrian I accepted the Eastern Octoechos reform also for the Roman Church. Fully notated Noim manuscripts like the Gradual and the Antiphonary were written much later during the last decades of the 10th century, and the oral transmission of Gregorian chant is only testified by additions of Noim in sacramentaries. In the tonary, the whole repertory of Gregorian chant was ordered according to its modal classification of the octoechos. Michel Huglot developed in his dissertation the hypothesis about an original tonary which preceded the Metz tonary and the tonary of Saint Riquia. It was probably a coincidence that Pope Adrian I supported the Eastern octoechos reform, but it is also evident that Carolingian diplomats present at the synod did not get interest in the communication of the modes by intonations, called enechemata, for the first time. Nevertheless, it was the difference between Greek and Latin chant sources, and especially the particular function of the tonary in chant transmission, which led Peter Jeffrey to the conclusion that the huge repertoire of Roman chant was classified according to the octoechos a posteriori, while early manuscripts of Greek chant always used modal signatures. The fully notated graduals and antiphonries of the first generation, written by Frankish cantors, report a lot of details about accentuation and ornamentation, but the melodic structure was remembered orally by tropes. Sometimes a tonary was attached to these manuscripts, and the cantors could use it by looking for the incipit of an antiphon in question, in order to find the right psalmody according to the mode and the melodic ending of the antiphon, which was sung as a refrain during the recitation of the psalm. A Greek psaltist would sing a completely different melody according to the echoes indicated by the modal signature, while Frankish cantors had to remember the melody of a certain Roman chant before they communicated their idea of its mode and its psalmody in a tonary for all the cantors who will follow them. In this complex process of chant transmission, which followed Charlemagne's reform, the so-called Gregorian chant, or Franco-Roman chant, as it was written down about 150 years after the reform, was born. The tonary's function within chant transmission explains why local schools of Latin chant can be studied by the tonary. Hence, the tonary was still substantial for every chant reform between the 10th and the 12th centuries, like the reform of the Cluniac monastic association, the reform of monastic orders like the one around Bernard of Clairvaux for the Cistercians, a papal reform, like Abbot Desiderius realized at the Abbey Monte Cassino, or the reform of some monasteries of a certain region, as Abbot William of Volpiano did for certain abbeys in Burgundy and Normandy. The Carolingian names or Byzantine intonations for the 8 tones. In Carolingian times each of the 8 sections was opened by an intonation formula using the names like non-anine for the authentic and neagus or noeais for the plagal tones. In the living traditions of Orthodox chant, these formulas were called enechemata, and they were used by protopsaltes to communicate the basis tone for the Isan singers as well as the first note of the chant for the other singers. In his theoretical tonary Musica Disciplina, Aurelian of Virtuomi asked a Greek about the meaning of the intonation syllables used in Latin tonaries. My mind was usually moved by some of the names which were inscribed for the tones, as nonanine for the protis, and nine for the deuteris. Did they have any significance? So I asked a Greek how these could be translated into Latin. He answered that they did not mean anything, but they were rather expressions of joy. And the greater the harmony of the voice, the more syllables were inscribed to the tone. As in the Authentus protis, which was the first, they used 6 syllables as nine or non-anine. For Authentus tritus, which was smaller in measure, 5 syllables as noin were inscribed. In plagal tones the letters were similar to nine as neasis, according to them. When I asked him if there might be something similar in our language, the Greek added that I should rather think of something expressed by charioteers or ploughing peasants, when the voice had nothing else than this joy. The same contained the modulation of the tones. The practice of using abstract syllables for the intonation, as it was common for the use of enechemata among Byzantine salties, was obviously not familiar to Aurelian of Virtuomi. It was probably imported by a Byzantine legacy, when they introduced the Greek octoikos by a series of procession antiphons used for the Feast of Epiphany. Although the Latin names were not identical, there is some resemblance between the intonation formula of the echoes plagios tetatos nu gamma iota epsilon and the Latin name neagus, used as a general name for all 4 plagal tones. But there are some more obvious cases as particular names like aeonioin or an, which can be found in very few tonaries between Liege, Paris, Fleury, and Chartres. 2 of these tonaries have treatises and use a lot of Greek terms taken from ancient Greek theory. The later practice of the intonationed verses. The oldest tonaries, especially the Carolingian, like those of St. Riquia, Metz, Reichenau, and the earliest tonary in a trope of Limoges, only used the so-called Byzantine intonation formulas, as they were discussed by Aurelian of Virtuomi, Regino of Prum, and Bernau of Reichenau. But since the 10th century, also biblical verses were used. They were composed together in one antiphon, with each verse changing the tone and referring to the number of the tonus according to the system of Hucbald, similar to Guido of Arezzo's use of the solmization hymn Ut Quent Laxus. There were several different antiphons, as they can be found in the Hartke antiphonary of the treatise collection of Monte Cassino, but no one became so popular than a compilation of verses taken from the New Testament which started with Primum Curate Regnum Dei. Usually each verse is finished by a long melisma anoima which clearly show its potential to become a tool of improvisation and composition as well. The origin of these verses is unknown. In some tonaries, they replaced the Carolingian intonations as in the tonary by Bernau of Reichenau, but more often they were written under them or alternated with them in the subsections, like in a certain group which Michel Huglot called the Toulouse tonaries, but also in the tonary of Monte Cassino. Concerning the earliest fully notated chant manuscripts, it seems that the practice of singing the intonation formulas was soon replaced by by another practice, that of soloist intoned the beginning of an antiphon responsorium, or Alleluia, and after this incipit of the soloist the choir continued. These changes between precantor and choir were usually indicated by an asterisk or by the use of maiuscula at the beginning the chant text. The psalmody could be indicated by an incipit of the required psalm and the differential notated over the syllables evova after the communio or introit antiphon.